Honestly, the biggest opinion I have is that we've made it really hard to write software. Like when I started, you were able to FTP a PHP script onto a server and it was live. You didn't have to do anything else. It was just, you could even edit the script or the file on the server and it just updated in real time.
Machines are so fast and stores are so big that they give us plenty of latitude to screw things up.
The shell, which is the name we give to the command interpreter.
So the operator got a pair of tweezers and very carefully fished the moth out of the relay.
Because you all read the Mythical Man Month.
And the best motivator in the world for programming is scratching your own itch.
Developers, 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 developers.
Hello and welcome to the Sourcecraft podcast. Today I'm talking with David Cramer, the creator of Sentry, a popular application error monitoring tool used by companies like Microsoft, Atlassian, Dropbox, and more. David tells me about how Sentry began as just 70 lines of code he wrote to answer a question in an IRC channel, how it caught on and has evolved with the emergence of new computing platforms and paradigms, and how Sentry thinks about product, marketing, and its long-term vision today. It's the story of how an open source side project became one of today's most widely used tools for tracking and fixing errors in production. Stay tuned. All right, I'm here with David Cramer, former engineer at Dropbox and now founder and CTO of Sentry, an open source tool for monitoring and resolving errors in production. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here today.
So to kind of kick things off, what's your quick life story as an engineer, starting with how you first got into programming?
So I'm very much the stereotypical self-taught. I think the first things I really did was, there used to be this thing. I say used to be because it's not really well known these days, called IRC. And specifically, there's this Windows client for it called MIRC, which had the most terrible scripting language you can possibly imagine. And so I just started writing scripts while I'm chatting on the internet. I don't even remember what half of them did these days. The other half was probably not stuff you should do as a professional, I would say. But I don't know, it kind of like, it got me interested in, I could build things, right? And then sort of in tandem, I was a big gamer at that age. I think as a lot of kids. And I found that you could, I found you could engage a lot of folks by sort of building gaming. Like you could basically take your hobby and merge it with this other hobby. And like what I did was I ended up building like gaming databases. So I think the first significant one I did was for World of Warcraft, but it basically I data mined a lot of the code or the details of the game and published them on the internet. And this is right when WoW was coming out and getting popular and stuff. And I think that was like the first real endeavor I had where I'm like, oh, wow, there's actually like something serious here that I can do that's actually really interesting and fun versus I just built a silly script or something. And then, you kind of just continue that path and one thing leads to another.
How did you end up at Dropbox?
So I'm from the Midwest originally, from Nebraska. And when I started doing this gaming stuff, which was when I was like, 19 or something, I took a job. I don't know if it was legally allowed to be a job, but I took a job with a company that was it was a bunch of kids. We're all the same age living in Germany. And we were basically building one of these World of Warcraft websites, one of these databases. And that company is called Curse. It's now part of Twitch, which I guess is part of Amazon. I don't know. Just one snake eating the other. So that took me to Germany for a little bit. I worked with that company a couple years. There was only like 5 of us at the time. And then it took me to San Francisco. And so I did that, eventually left that company, went to work with one of my buddies, left San Francisco, realized life was not nearly as interesting outside of SF, especially if you're really into software at the time. And, I came back, worked for another tech company called Discuss, which, isn't really around much these days, but it's, big internet comments provider. And did that for a while, eventually decided, and that's also where I started Sentry formally, and then decided it was time for something else. And I kind of limited my options of the kind of job I wanted. And it was based on what I enjoyed doing. And that was like, I enjoyed doing things that had like high reach. So kind of interesting scale problems. And I just wanted to work with Python, the programming language. And so I was basically like, well, I can join Instagram or I can join Dropbox. And one of them requires me to commute to South Bay. So Dropbox was a good choice for that.
Awesome. And, I want to dive into kind of the backstory of Sentry a little bit. But before we get into that, I want to first describe to our audience what Sentry is. So, if you're describing Sentry to an engineer who has never heard of it before, what is it?
So I probably have an infinite number of descriptors for it. Like the way I usually try to reason about it is that's kind of a way to take it away from engineering first off, but you load up the Uber app, it crashes. What do you do as a user? Well, personally, I would just load Lyft because I have no brand loyalty. It doesn't really matter. And that's actually pretty common, right? And so when you take that in mind, that's the problem we're solving for. That's the reality of the world, right? And so we're like, okay, like the advantage of a company in that situation is to be able to respond to those customers like issues very, very quickly. So what we do is we collect all that information about that crash or other application errors, and we send that to the engineering team that is actually responsible for that application. So it really helps them diagnose and hopefully fix errors very quickly. I think the classic thing now is if somebody knows what Sentry is and they experience an error in the world, they're just like calling out the company. It's like, hey, are you using Sentry? Like, why aren't you fixing your bugs kind of thing? So I think it implicitly suggests that it's a proactive way for software teams to actually like resolve their issues, which is true, but that's still up to the software team at the end of the day.
Yeah, it makes sense. So when you say, the Uber app, if they're using Sentry, they'll kind of send the errors over and their development team is able to kind of dig into those. Does that require kind of instrumenting that application with some sort of Sentry client-side agent, or does it do smart things to kind of automatically figure out what to do?
Yeah, so we really try for a frictionless process. So I'm the type of builder that is very pragmatic. I think it's interesting to solve interesting problems just like anybody, but frankly, I'm super lazy and I just want to like get to the cleanest, fastest solution I can. And that's the same for like when we build something for our customers. So it's like for Sentry, it's very much like you install our dependency, you tell us the API key, which we give you, and then most of the time it works from there. There's a lot of advanced stuff you can do that requires you to put in effort, but for the most part, 80% of the value is just out of the box. You don't have to do anything. That's actually been one of our big selling points for a very long time. And that's kind of the same for every device. It gets a little bit trickier, if you're, say, writing compiled code or something seriously complex, you have to set up some other processes, but for the most part, it works the same.
Cool. I feel like laziness is almost like a key developer value. It's good to be lazy in a lot of cases.
I think it's especially good if you're building productivity or tooling, or you're sort of a product owner, because it's going to hopefully get you to like the best solution you can with the least amount of cost.
Yeah, just the essentials.
Yeah.
Cool. And kind of taking a step back, nowadays there's a whole kind of landscape of production monitoring tools, things that help people diagnose errors in deployment environments. Can you kind of give us your view of that landscape and where Sentry fits into all of that?
Yep. So I think there's a lot of ways to slice it, but the simplest way is there's sort of historical solutions. I bucket them into a few categories. The first would be logging. So you can think of that like as Splunk or Kibana, but pretty well known to folks. Second would be sort of this monitoring persona, which is, graphs at the end of the day. It's usually graphs monitoring your system metrics. That's Datadog would be the market leader. And then the third is what we would describe as an APM vendor, which would be New Relic. And the APM vendors are a little fuzzy because they actually try to do everything these days. But the core of what they started as was, I will tell you why your application is slow, which is the value add they originally gave you, right? That landscape's kind of changed over the years because, like, you'll note I didn't say anything about error monitoring in there. So, once upon a time, that kind of all worked and people just dealt with the fact that it wasn't ideal. And I think a lot of the changes over the years from how we develop software sort of forced us to think about, like, are these tools solving problems? And then, the error monitoring, I wouldn't call it a category, but the error monitoring functionality, the way Sentry provides it, which is quite drastically different than logs, that's become more of a necessity when we've had a lot more front ends, so mobile, browser, desktop applications that really need this rich monitoring. And on top of that, like, sort of the breadth of the internet and the depth, I guess, of an individual property has gotten much bigger. So you end up with a lot more data, a lot more errors, a lot more customers. And so it just gets harder to reason about all the data. So kind of like, I think there's this new wave of things. So that was the old style, right? APM, all this other stuff. And we sort of think the new wave looks somewhat similar to the old wave, but the difference I would say now is there's application monitoring. Don't get that confused with APM. And then there is systems monitoring. And so systems, you can think of it as infrastructure monitoring at the end of the day. It's easiest to say, like, if I am running the platform layer, that is, I'm building the layer that lets you ship your business logic, I need systems monitoring. I'm dealing with the servers. I have CPUs. I have disks. I need to rotate disks. I need to do all that stuff, right? All that makes sense. If I'm building the business layer, the business logic, and especially when you think about serverless and these kind of paradigms, I don't care at all about that platform layer. I only care about it when you force me to care about it, which should be never at the end of the day. And so we think there's a solution that's needed to really focus in on that, to focus in on this idea that you don't control the machine. And so what's the relevant information to surface? And so that's really what we say we're doing, what we're trying to do. But like one version of that is error monitoring. And frankly, I would tell you the first version of that is error monitoring because it goes super deep. And the way we do it, not only does it go really deep, but it's tightly coupled to the commit graph and the source code, which is really all you can control as a developer. And so we think there's a lot more concerns to address there. But that's fundamentally how I see the landscape. And it's like we really just say, we're building something for application developers, which, that's a little bit of a spiel. Like it's not entirely truthful, of course, but you can kind of get the idea. And the cleanest separation is if you say, well, we're building something for front-end developers because people historically have thought of them as a different persona.
Sure.
And they are. But like so much of our business logic is on the front end these days, you can no longer ignore it. So it's a way that we center the gravity around kind of what we think is most important. And frankly, a lot of the infrastructure monitoring tools, they're really mature and they're really, really good. But they don't solve the rest of the problem. So that's kind of how I see it. And it's just those two scopes in the landscape.
Yeah, that also makes sense. The focus on front-end developers is interesting because, when you think about traditionally the types of people who are digging into errors in production, it's like the opposite of those folks, right?
Yeah.
Very opsy, back-endy folks.
Yep. And I think it was like a necessity. So I don't know if you've ever worked at a company like this, but for sure Dropbox was like this. If you wanted to know about problems in production, you're certainly not getting access to the server to go look at logs, right? And frankly, logs are actually pretty sensitive these days, right? Especially with things like GDPR. So you're probably just not getting access, period. And, Dropbox is a little bit ahead of the curve, just like every, giant tech company has been. They had their own sort of Sentry-like thing internally. Now, it wasn't nearly as good as Sentry. And I'm not saying that just because I built Sentry, but they'll tell you that too. But they knew that they needed something like that, right? And big companies recognize that problem. And so that's kind of how we've thought about it, ultimately.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, as a front-end developer going to Sentry, like what kind of data am I looking at? Like, what does that interface look like? Am I just kind of doing like open-ended data exploration on some like SQL table that I have with like pretty graphs, or is it something else?
Yeah, so that's actually, in our case, we're very specific and intentional that we say we're trying to give you answers, not search tools. So we're not trying to let you go, exploring caves. We just want to say that's where the treasure is and here's a zip line right to it kind of thing. And so what we give you is as much as we possibly can, which again, that's a little bit of a gray area these days, especially with privacy controls. But the baseline is we give you a stack trace, which most engineers should understand, but it's just like sort of the program instructions that were invalid. We do that in sort of specialized ways though, which is important. So in JavaScript, it's just JavaScript code, looks like a normal stack trace. In compiled code, it's very different than a normal stack trace. But also when you go to like cross language, we actually blend those together as well. So for example, if you're using React Native on mobile, we'll actually give you the JavaScript and the iOS stack trace sort of merged together. And so that's just like one minor example of something we do that like makes it easier for a human to understand what's going on. So we take that and then we actually, not only do we give you sort of that rich view, but we give you surrounding source code, which means you don't have to jump to an editor or to GitHub or something else to understand what's going on. We'll often, in some languages, give you things like context locals, which are basically variables that are defined during that exception, which is hugely valuable for debugging because that's your inputs at the end of the day. And then we'll try to give you a little bit of sort of user behavior, but Pi-hole, please don't ban us again. But we give user behavior in the sense of like, here's sort of the steps that led up to this bug, right? So it might be the person clicked these 3 elements or something, or they navigated from this URL to this URL to this URL, and that triggered this bug. And that's actually really useful in JavaScript, but actually isn't useful at all in other languages. So we actually have taken a stance of like, let's specialize it a little bit language by language because it is actually different in each of those. And then we allow you to send whatever else is helpful. So for Sentry, for example, we send a lot of information about like the kind of customer. So that might be like we say, well, this is a super important customer, or it's a free customer, or I'm trying to think what else we even do there. But we also send like diagnostic information, like this is the device it happened on, this is the operating system, this is the browser name, things like that, right? We used to famously tell folks, you no longer have to guess if it's Internet Explorer that's broken. Now you know it's Internet Explorer, which was funnier when people still used Internet Explorer and knew what that meant. But yeah, so it's really about like, can we just get you the right answer instead of you having to ask more questions, which for the most part we can these days.
So it sounds like, there's some kind of instrumentation monitoring tools that take the approach of like, hey, we're just going to give you a bunch of key metrics like that are derived from the application layer or the systems layer, and then you're supposed to go and figure out how to piece that together. It sounds like you're not doing that. You're kind of really designing for this front-end developer persona first and foremost. Like, if you were in a front-end developer's shoes, what are all the pieces of information that you would want access to when you go diving into some production issues? Is that right?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. We basically just say, if you can't change the machine, what's the root cause? If you're out of memory, you can't add memory, how do you fix it? Well, you look at the code that caused you to run out of memory, or the change in the code that caused that behavior to happen, right? So we actually say our goal, and we don't do this all the time, and it's a really hard problem, but our goal is to say root cause is the commit that created this issue at the end of the day. And that's true for 95% of failures at the end. Like, yeah, you'll have incidents where, say, AWS goes down and that affects your service, but that's not really what we're optimizing around. We're optimizing around velocity of I guess, shipping new software.
Yeah, makes sense. Are there other tools that you see people using Sentry in conjunction with, or that you would recommend deploying alongside Sentry?
I think many. So the ecosystem these days, or rather a developer's world, is very complex, right? Like, you yourselves are sort of what we describe as like an adjacent tool. And we always thought about it. There's a lot of stuff that can play well, I guess, in the ecosystem. It can make a developer's life better, which usually just translates to efficiency, right? I think the 4 core pillars of that are... and we sort of look at, like, what's the old style SDLC, software development lifecycle, which I didn't know what that meant, by the way, before 4 years ago. But we look at that and we're like...
It's a marketing term.
Yeah. So we're like, well, okay, what you do as a developer is you write code, so you develop, you test the code, which, is CI most of the time these days, right? You release the code, and then you need to monitor the code. And there's a lot of different paradigms of that. Some people call monitor learn, which would be more like a product analytics angle. But we just think about those 4, and we're like, okay, Sentry is the solution to monitor it, but we're not the solution for any of the rest of it, right? And so there's all these other adjacent tools that I think make a ton of sense there. And things like SourceGraph certainly help the speed of development. Like, they help much earlier in the life cycle. We help much later. But we always kind of say, like, we picture this like slot machine kind of thing for a visual, and you spin the wheel, and Sentry's always going to be a solution for monitoring. You don't need anything else, but you can swap out the rest of the components. So we're actually big believers that the ecosystem matters a lot, because one company can't solve all the problems. Yeah. But we also believe that we can solve all of the monitoring problems for an application. We don't yet, but we will over time.
That makes sense. What do you make of, you mentioned log aggregators. There's also things like Prometheus, which give you kind of like time series overview of like key metrics. There's distributed tracers. Are those all kind of tools that you eventually want to bring kind of under the umbrella of the Sentry use case, or are any of them kind of like outside of your eventual scope?
So you might call me an anti-thought leader. I am not on the bandwagon of observability. I'm not on the bandwagon of distributed tracing. I believe they're all just marketing shims. But I will say that Sentry has implemented distributed tracing for its customers for our new performance product, and it looks wildly different than anybody else's product. And why that is because we're very focused on what the output is. And I will also tell you that we have metrics that you can alert on, and we don't collect any metrics. And so what Sentry's done, and this is an impossible problem to solve, so this will certainly not be our full forever solution, but we basically suck in a ton of events in a most abstract way. Just imagine we suck in a lot of events. Some of them are errors. Some of them are what we call transactions, which are a segment of a trace, but it's a request response lifecycle. We pipe those into the system, and then we extrapolate from there. We extrapolate, is this a problem? Is it a new error? Is it a unique error? We extrapolate, is it slow, which is just the metric that's accumulated from all those together, things like that. And so I'm a big believer in that model. Unfortunately, like, if you just can imagine the amount of data in the world, that it doesn't scale, of course. But that's kind of how we thought about it. So we will serve those things. I don't know about logs. I think logs have multiple uses, but I think traces in particular are just a means to an end. Like, the way I describe traces to most folks is open telemetry, which is what the format's called now, is just an open source version of New Relic's schema. Ultimately, that would be my intention behind it. It's not some new kind of problem in the world. And so we've taken that idea, because it's really good work, and I think the tracing products, they've got a lot of smart people behind. But we've taken that and we said the product that people need is New Relic. The data might come from tracing, but the product output looks more like New Relic. And so that's what we're building. There are some advanced questions you can answer by using like end-to-end traces, but for the most part, you're a mobile developer. You're not looking at what's going on way down the stack in the database, right? Like, you have no idea what that even means. You just need to know, is my mobile app performing well? And so that's like a really important lens we put on it. But to circle back to logging, I think that's an interesting one, because logs actually, they amount to a few things. One, they're like this duct tape solution for any problem you have. Like if you look at Elastic, they're just like put everything in a log, or Splunk, probably the same thing. And you can make metrics exist, and you can aggregate things together and do all this crazy stuff, which is not a super effective solution. But we basically say logs are for audit trails, like first and foremost. It's for compliance and it's for security. You must have that stuff. It's not an opinion. It's not a discussion point. That's like a mandatory requirement for all organizations. You can't change that, right? But then there's also this idea of logs for debugging. And that's really where it gets interesting, because technically speaking, Sentry collects logs with its errors. We call them breadcrumbs. Just like user click this, that's just a log at the end of the day. And so we've thought a lot about, and we frankly will probably build it, just allowing developers to send us logs as well, because it's very helpful in the debugging process. But I think the challenge is, and rightfully so, nobody wants to pay, duplicate fees for all of this stuff, right? So if we're collecting logs and they're sending them to, say, Datadog and Splunk and all these other things, they're not going to be super thrilled about all the money they're just throwing away for no reason. So I think that's a tricky area yet, but I do think tracing is just, it's a means to an end more than it is a, different product.
Got it. That makes sense. Can I get you to talk more about observability? Because, full disclosure, another person we're going to have on the show is Charity Majors of Honeycomb, and I think they basically coined the term. So, I would love to get your kind of candid thoughts, if you're willing to share on that kind of idea as a movement and the issues that you kind of see with it.
I would say you've never had to force somebody to do something that's very valuable for them. Maybe never is the wrong word there. And this idea that we're changing what monitoring is, I don't think is true at all. And so I'll give you an example. If you collect traces and you do no work, so say you put them in there by default, right? And that's the idea of observability, is it exists and then you can go ask questions. Well, all of your data is useless. You still have to go add new instrumentation to make it more useful. And that completely breaks the idea that we're doing anything different than we ever did before. We're still reacting to problems and then adding additional telemetry at the end of the day. It's just the reality of the world. Now you could say, well, one of the things we're enabling, because Honeycomb is based on the concept Scuba, Scuba is our internal version, Scuba from Facebook, which every big company has a Scuba, right? And we now have a Scuba ourselves. And that model is really good. But that's just an infrastructure service at the end of the day. It's just a very fast log search is the way I think about it. And that's a really powerful thing. That, if you said that was observability, just being able to completely, just to 100% just decide of ask questions to your data, that's great. I truly believe in that. But observability to me and a lot of these things you see is just marketing. And we've never been great at marketing, which is probably why we don't do any of those things. But we've also never needed it. We don't really have to convince developers that error monitoring is valuable. We didn't even have a word for it for a long time ago. We're just I don't know, we aggregate exceptions or something, right? And I think it's just, I don't see what people are doing is any different than what they were doing 20 years ago, ultimately. And that's my issue with it. And it's the same with APM. We're trying to solve the same problems that New Relic solved 10, 15 years ago, whenever it was born, right? Now, they don't solve them that well these days, but their solutions were still really good ideas. And we're just trying to make a better version of that really good idea. And that's where I think people, because it's better to be different than it is to be, the same or similar. And I think people are too focused on that. And I just don't care about that. So I'm just I don't know, we're kind of building APM at the end of the day. It's the same thing it's always been. It's like a category of stuff that sort of does these things. And observability is just monitoring at the end of the day. And, and that's kind of my gripes with it is I don't care about talking about it. I'd rather just be building a great product for people to use. And whatever you want to call it, you can call it. But that's where I lie.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you said something, and I just want to kind of repeat it back to you just to kind of see if you agree with this. I kind of got the sense that your impression of observability is it's trying to say that hey, we have this completely new way of thinking about telemetry and instrumentation. Basically, send every single event you could ever care about to our service, and so it's all accessible. You never have to worry about having forgotten to instrument something, have to go back and add that piece of instrumentation later. It's just this giant infinitely wide data blob which you can kind of explore at your leisure. And what you're saying is that's kind of a pipe dream, that you're always going to add some amount of instrumentation. There's always going to be kind of a shortcoming in what you're able to collect. And then the process is just add the instrumentation that you need now, and then at some point it's going to fall short, and then go back and add more instrumentation later to get that data into whatever production dashboard it is you're using to debug those issues. Is that about right?
That's very much how I feel about it. And I will say the improvement we've gotten as an industry is the old way to add instrumentation by default was logs, right? Very unstructured. It was just human text at the end of the day. And we've at least improved upon that, where a lot of people do like JSON-based logging, so just key values, right? Which is valuable, of course. And tracing being built into libraries is actually very valuable because now we actually have real annotations. Now, the problem is, if their annotations aren't good, you're still back in the starting point where it's not instrumented well enough. So I just think it's an unsolvable problem, and you have to give people the right tools. And so I think the tech that everybody's building is really good. And, we use ClickHouse, which is open source. So you can think of it as like an open source, in a very naive way. It's open source Honeycomb or open source Scuba or something like that. That tech is super powerful. Like, we've replaced our entire logging infrastructure with ClickHouse at this point, and we can ask like real-time questions on it, which is great, but we still have to record the right sort of preemptive answers to those real-time questions in it at the end of the day. And that's where that falls down. But it's still a good iteration on technology.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important.
You mentioned that kind of the fundamental problem that you're trying to solve is kind of the same one that the New Relics and the Datadogs of the world are going after. Why do you think it is that they've been unable to effectively solve that problem?
So I guess I don't want to say arrogant, but my like real view of the situation is a lot of people build stuff for themselves. And that's no different than me. Like, Sentry was just me solving my own problem. I think the difference for me and a lot of other folks is I know infrastructure, but I'm not just an infrastructure person. I'm very much full stack, and I like building the end user experience, right? And so we quickly bias towards like, we actually want this to be about the end user, the customer, versus we're building another systems monitoring tool. And that's fine that people do that. But what you'll see is a lot of folks that are building new generations of technology, they end up being very biased, and they're just solving infrastructure monitoring like with another flavor of the week kind of thing. And that's probably not giving enough credit, but I think that's the problem. So we're launching our performance thing in July, and we said JavaScript first. If we can't solve JavaScript, it doesn't happen, because that's the most important language in the world right now. That's not even subjective. And it's also much harder to solve for than, say, Python. Like, we solved Python in like 1 week, and JavaScript we've been at like for multiple months trying to make it work well. And I think it just, people stick with their comfort zone. I think technology also changes, and big companies rarely keep up. So that's part of it. Like a lot of these newer sort of systems monitoring companies wouldn't exist if these big companies were able to keep a product that worked really well, right? And I think Datadog's done a really good job of their core. But if you look at, say, Datadog APM, I'm like, it doesn't really do anything. It's just like you slapped APM on this thing that actually doesn't do a lot for a developer. And for me, that's really frustrating, because I got to deal with this idea of like, how is it different than Datadog? And I'm like, it's another one. How's it different than logs? Like, back to square one. But yeah, so I think a lot of it's like technology changes, paradigms change a little bit, but not all that much. But, I think it's mostly just like scale of data concerns. So
yeah.
So I think we'll keep seeing that over, probably the lifetime of software. But
would it be fair to say that kind of the evolution of the production monitoring space of tools is kind of dictated by trying to solve the same essential problem, but for like each new computing platform or like paradigm that comes along, just kind of updating the model to fit to that specific world?
I think some of it. So I'm going to give you an example that's very much not that. So I'll give you one on each. So let's take microservices. I still refuse to believe anybody truly operates with microservices, because the complexity is just, it's ridiculous, like, right? But service architectures have been around forever, right? And microservices, hypothetically, and like in a macro level, are no different than service architectures, especially at like a Google scale, right? And so that problem does not change anything fundamentally. Like, the problem is the same problem it's always been. You solve it in the same kind of ways, right? On the counter side, and this is a real issue, so we have an internal service that uses GraphQL, which is Facebook's graph query language that some JavaScript people love, which also introduces a ton of complexity. And one of the first things you see with complexity is all of a sudden, any version of tracing makes no sense, because you have no aggregation points. Because if you think about any kind of like performance overview, you need to be able to group things together to be able to understand a higher level characteristic. But the core idea of GraphQL is you can just specify whatever you want in the query at any given point in time. So there is no aggregation point at all. And so then you end up with this question of like, does there have to be a specialized solution to that? Or do we need to modify what we're doing to just fit with a standard? And I actually don't know the answers to those. Like, there is actually like specialized solutions for GraphQL performance monitoring, which is mind blowing. Like, why should that have to exist? And now that's why I like certain current generation of the world is like things like OpenTelemetry. If they truly remain open, which, that's always a risky area, of course, but like if they truly remain open and they get adoption, so they actually become a standard, well, maybe then we start adapting to standards instead of sort of forcing ourselves to recreate everything. Because like, obviously as engineers, we just like rebuilding things over and over.
Of course.
Sometimes it's good,
yeah.
But often it's 2 steps back and 1 step forward.
Yeah. On OpenTelemetry, I think one of the questions is standards kind of evolve to fit the reality that has kind of emerged. And then when that reality changes, it's often like standards are kind of a lagging indicator, right? There's always, it's often like an individual company that, identifies a need that's unmet by the existing standards and the existing ecosystem that's tied to that standard and goes after that first. Do you think that OpenTelemetry is general enough, kind of like future proof? Or do you think that, it has evolved for the kind of the current trend in, microservices or service-oriented architectures, and after that wave crests, then it might become obsolete?
So I think for what it does, it's hard to predict, obviously, but I think it does a good job for what it does, and I don't see it being replaced. Now, the problem is it doesn't do everything. So we wrote up a spec which was very similar to not similar to OpenTelemetry. That's giving our stuff too much credit, but it was basically a distributed tracing spec. It was a distributed tracing spec based on our way of thinking, which is actually quite different than what OpenTelemetry achieves. And the way I would describe that is OpenTelemetry is about small annotations, lots and lots and lots of small annotations. Like I read something the other day, it was on Hacker News, where I think somebody on behalf of Twitter was suggesting that they had traces with 1 million plus spans. And that's ludicrous to reason about. Like our stuff won't even support that right now. And when I think about that, I'm like, okay, that probably makes it more useful. But the problem is when you think about spans, they're very, very useful because they suggest like function call at the end of the day. But if you try to use spans for actual profiling, like C profiling, like you're going to have hundreds of millions of these and it won't work at all. Like it's too fat of a data structure. And then on the counter side, if you need really rich information, which is what Sentry collects, it doesn't fit into that model because it's too big. Like if you had 1 million of these spans and all the spans are like 10 times the size they are now, no system's ever going to be able to handle that. And so I do think there's still got to be middle grounds. And I think OpenTelemetry, the core concepts will stick because the core concepts have been around forever and they make a lot of sense, right? At least the core concepts of distributed tracing and things like described in the Dapper paper. OpenTelemetry has evolved to have a bunch of other things. And I don't know if I have enough of an opinion to say they're good or bad, but it does feel kind of like all specs where it just gets bloated over time and there's a bunch of stuff tacked on to please other people. So I don't know. We'll see. I do think it's good either way. It's good to have better instrumentation built into libraries, but I worry that there's still an adoption curve that's never going to get past where, yeah, we'll have this pretty good standard, which could solve a lot of problems, but it never will be fully adopted. Probably if nothing else, because to like implement the other side, the collector side, that's where a lot of opinions come into place, and that can completely change how valuable the data is. So, I don't know. And then I feel like there's not much else out there that's any kind of standard, right? Like, even Sentry stuff. Like, at some point, big company that I can't name suggested, like, oh, we should open source the error schema, and then they'll help us collaborate, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, why would we do that? Like, what is there for us to gain as a company? We're like the market leader. Open sourcing, it just helps our competitors. And I think on the counter side, okay, this is a little bit of a segue, but one thing I always loved about Python was this concept of BDFL that Guido had, or Guido. And I loved it because it said, I have an opinion. It doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong, but at least we'll keep going in the same direction. I guess Linux was a little bit of this way too, right? And we basically said that's what Sentry is. Like, it's open source, but it's not community built. It's very much like we decide what the direction is. And I think that's truly, truly important. And I think this is often where things become crippled and they just stagnate, is when there is not just like an overriding force of saying, no, we're doing this. Who cares? Like, just deal with it. If you don't like it, that's your problem. And so I would worry that about OpenTelemetry.
You're trying to please everyone. That's the fallacy you fall into.
And you could see, like, Kubernetes, I don't know, like, is Kubernetes going to exist in 5 years? It's hard to say. It's like super complex, and there's a lot of stuff that keep getting crammed into it. Like,
what's your take on that prediction now? Will Kubernetes exist in 5 years? Go.
If it does, there's going to be another layer above it that anybody can understand, because like it's gotten so complex and so hard to reason about, and at this point I'm like, okay, now we're falling back, and it's almost just a different version of Chef or Puppet or something else. It's just gone back into that bucket where it's just so complex, and and it's very case by case, and I don't know. We'll see. But I feel like we create a lot of complexity in a lot of things we do as software engineers and as sort of, especially on the open source side. And we don't often do a lot to simplify that complexity. We just find ways to add more. Like NPM is a good example of this. But yeah, I don't know. As I remember talking to somebody, I was getting coached on doing a press interview one time, and they're like, well, what do you care about? Like, what do you have an opinion on? And I'm like, honestly, the biggest opinion I have is that we've made it really hard to write software. Like, when I started, you were able to FTP a PHP script onto a server, and it was live. You didn't have to do anything else. It was just, you could even edit the script or the file on the server, and it just updated in real time. Now I've got to like install a bundler. I've got to have multiple services running. I've got to figure out how to deploy this to AWS. So like, I need all this other stuff, which, you know, for scale, a lot of that's good, but we certainly did create a massive barrier to entry for a lot of folks.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's like necessary complexity just because, you know, modern applications have to be more robust, they have to reach more people and users? Or do you think it's, you know, there's something unnecessary about all the stuff that you have to kind of set up on the deployment side these days?
I think it's both. Some of it is certainly necessary. Like, we've developed much better technology that, like, we have really rich, fast-acting user interfaces, for example, right? And like, that needs new technology and new hardware and all these other things. So I think some of it's needed. And then we do simplify some of it. But then the other side of things, we're just stubborn and we like reinventing things. And you can see infinite versions of that. And so, I don't know. I think open source on one hand makes this better, where if sort of predominantly there's a great open source solution to most core problems that are not your business logic, you're probably going to use that, frankly. Like, why wouldn't you? And so I think that's valuable. But the counter side of that is also like, even like Sentry, when we switched our license to BSL, they're like, oh, just fork Sentry. And I'm like, great, there will be a bad version of Sentry in the world. It won't be called Sentry, but it'll be a bad version of Sentry. And I'm like, that'll be outcome. And all of a sudden now we fractured again. We went from like solving the problem very well to now we have, you know, two solutions that may or may not be solving it really well. And I think that's always where we break off. And I think a lot of that, I don't know. So like, I'm not formally educated. Like, maybe part of this is education. It's like academics, and like you need to go through the like more like computer history. But the problem is it changes so quickly. And the benefit of tech is you don't need that barrier. Like, you're not required to go through that. So I don't know. It's kind of one of those things that I don't know there's a right answer.
Yeah. I also tend to think that, like, you know, when the history behind things, a lot of it ends up being narrative to kind of reinforce like present objectives too, I think. Like there's always that kind of tendency, bias, not necessarily conscious, just to tell the story of the past in a way that favors what you want the present and future to look like.
That's definitely true.
Tell me about open source. So you mentioned that, you know, if there's an open source version of something that you want to deploy into production, you'll probably want to use that. And I definitely think that like that's something that a lot of developers feel. Like, I much prefer to use something that's open source than proprietary. And, you know, Sentry itself is open source. How did you kind of arrive at the decision to do that? And are there parts of what you sell that are not open source? And how do you kind of decide what the boundary line between those are?
So first, Sentry it just started as open source because I would just open source everything because it was fine. I didn't care. Like, I never intended to build a business or anything like that. And I like the open source community. It was really nice to be able to engage with people that were interested in your work, right? And so that's kind of how it all started. And sort of because of that, and because it's self-hostable, right? Like, we actually just went down the path of, like, generally speaking, we can't use proprietary software because we're not going to be able to give that proprietary software to our customers, and we want them to be able to use our product. Like, we're optimizing around people using our product, like, not profit or anything else at the end of the day. And I think over time, the open source ecosystem has shifted a lot in the sense of, like, when we raised money 5 years ago, everybody except, I actually think literally everybody except our seed investor, which was Dan Levine from Excel, and maybe even him, frankly, are like, how are you going to make money on this? And we were profitable. We were making a healthy amount of money at that point. And they're still like, how are you going to make money on this? And I still truly believe this. My answer was, it doesn't matter. If we can't make money, nobody else is going to. Like, that was very much our conviction, right? And it was more like, just stop asking me this. We'll figure it out. Like, you don't ask other people that question. Like, they don't make any money and you give them a lot of money, so it doesn't really matter. But so we started out as that. It was like, no, we just like open source. Like, we believe open source is a really good model, and we don't see that there's a risk to it. And, you know, over the years went by, it changed a little bit. The next question was like, well, why won't AWS just run this? Like if you build a big business, why won't they just do what they did to Elastic, right? And we're like, doesn't matter. We'll solve that problem if it happens. Like we'll just change the code base and say if AWS crash or something like that, right? Like it's just like that was not what was important to us. It's like we're just trying to build something that like all developers can use. And that was the fundamental goal forever and still is. It's written into our values at this point. And we actually recently, I don't know, sometime last year, changed our license. It used to be BSD, and we changed it to BSL, which is just a proprietary license. It's proprietary, but it's somewhat known, right? And so if you call it open source, a bunch of people on the internet will yell at you. I frankly think they should stop giving people a hard time, and they should value the fact that free software is still free. But so that was our bridge, and that bridge like we created purely because, and I guess quick caveat, BSL, you can do anything you want with Sentry, keep the license intact. You cannot sell a competing product to Sentry. And after, I forget what our timeline is, 2 or 3 years, it becomes Apache 2. So it's kind of in my opinion, it's a good license. And everybody that is doing open core or something similar should maybe consider BSL.
So if I want to
license.
If I want to deploy like Sentry within my organization, I can spin it up for free and not have to worry about being bound by any proprietary license as long as I don't launch a competing product. Okay.
Exactly. And that's important to understand, or why that is important is because we don't actually have any proprietary features or code as part of the core of Sentry. We do have proprietary code, but it's our infrastructure and things like that. Like what you see on GitHub is literally what we ship to production multiple times a day, right? We ship some other stuff like billing code and stuff next to it, but that's why we wanted this, because we're like, well, we can still give it away for free, which was our goal. It was accessibility. It wasn't, oh yeah, you should fork and use our code. And like, steal is legally the wrong word, but like you didn't build it. Why should you have all these rights to do whatever the hell you want with it? You shouldn't. It's entitlement, right? And so we just took a moral stance. We're like, this is what we believe is right and just, and we'll do it. And so we made that change. But frankly, we mostly made it because, I won't name names, but like startups randomly taking our code and not crediting us. And I'm just like, I'm tired of this. Like, I don't have the like mental energy to deal with these annoying companies. It wasn't because we were afraid of AWS or anything like that. I think they'd rather partner than try to run it. So it's not a big deal. But yeah, it's just we've always had that conviction. And so like by default, basically everything in Sentry has been open source, and every company I've worked at has strongly encouraged or given freedom for open source. Both, Dropbox and Discuss were really, really big on that, which I valued a lot. And I think often goes unappreciated, but it would be cool to see more companies. Everybody hates on Facebook these days, but like I'd like to see more companies contribute in ways like Facebook has. Like React is phenomenal for the industry, right? And they've done so much for that space. And so hopefully we get to see more and more of that. Because like once you've got corporate sponsorship from that kind of way, right? It's not necessarily a community building React, it's Facebook. Yeah. Like you're actually able to build a really great product. So yeah, but I don't know. I think it's a great industry. It's just open source is generally hard to monetize. So I think
definitely
that's the challenge for folks.
I think there's a lot of, especially developer tool creators who want to kind of make the right trade-off there. Like developers love open source for a good reason. There's nothing worse than having a tool that breaks in some way where you can't dive into the source code and understand what's going on. But at the same time, got to pay the bills, got to, build an engine that actually sustains a business so you can continue to invest in and improve the tool. And that's kind of an ongoing challenge. Kind of going, back in time to the origin stories of Sentry. So you mentioned that you started it while you were at Discuss. Can you talk through, what motivated you to create it and, what the project was like in those early days?
So Sentry, going back to even MIRC days, because this is how old that is. I was in Django, the web framework. I was in a Django users channel, so similar to as the mailing list would be. And somebody asked, very simply, I would just help users. And somebody asked how to log errors to a database so they could put them on a dashboard. And I'm like, why would you do that? And I'm like, this is how I would do it. And it was like 70 lines of code. And I published that. I called it Django DB log. Very, very clever name. And that was that. And then I just like hacking on things. So over the years, I added a few features because I'm like, this is kind of cool, I guess. And it was also during the time when Django was booming. And I became somewhat prolific in those days in Django in the sense of I built a lot of things that Django folks used. And this was one of them. And when I joined Discuss, they were using this. And so I'm like, oof. And actually, the first month, it might have been the first week, I actually took the Discuss service down. And it got even worse because of Django DB log, because of the original Sentry. It couldn't scale in scenarios where you had catastrophic failures. And so it just took us longer to recover, right? And so we're like, okay, let's fix this. Like, let's actually make this work at the scale that Discuss was, because they were pretty significant in request volume at the time. And so that's when Sentry was born. It still had a different name. It was Django Sentry, but we'll ignore that detail. And then I was at Discuss for about 3 years. Company always was pretty small when I was there. I think maybe when I left, it was 60 folks. So, you can think of small as like we had a lot of sort of autonomy and freedom, right? And I would just generally build a lot of open source stuff, and I would try to improve our tools and things like that as sort of my side projects. And Sentry, I just kept hacking on. And the thing that I think, and people don't give open source enough credit. They often complain like, why should I contribute or something like that? And then you talk about resumes. And for me, it was like, well, I'm contributing because like there's a bunch of companies that think what I'm doing is super cool. And I value that. That like makes me happier. And in this case, it was companies like Eventbrite and Mozilla and Instagram. And all of us were like up and comers to some degree at the time and all on Django. And so that was just exciting to me. So I got to network with a lot of peers that were really smart. And then over the course of that 3 years, I asked my now co-founder to help start like Sentry, the business per se. And so we did. I spun it up right before leaving Discuss, and then, ran that, I think for, I don't know, between 2.5, 3 years, something like that, during my transition from Discuss through Dropbox.
Got it.
And
so
then,
you were running the business on the side as you were a full-time engineer at Dropbox.
Yeah. And at first it was great. It was not a ton of work. As you get bigger, as success per se comes to you, it gets much trickier. Especially with an infrastructure monitoring tool. Like, you're collecting a lot of data. There's a lot of services that are running. So, and especially when you're bootstrapping it. Like, I'm actually very proud to say, asterisks of whatever the corporate filings say, like, I put no money into the company. And nor did my co-founder, nor did anybody else. It was bootstrapped from $0. We didn't have to pay our own salaries, which was very fortunate, but it was effectively profitable from day one. Day one until, sometime in VC land. And then, so we ran that for a few years, right? And I think, when I was leaving Dropbox, so I was there a little less than 2 years. Dropbox had grown really fast at that time. It had become like, to me, what was a big company. It was over 1,000 employees when I left, and it was like 250-ish when I joined. And at that stage of company, for me, at my, we'll call it my maturity level at the time, or my professional approach at the time, like, I didn't like that kind of company. Like, it wasn't empowering for me. I didn't feel like I could get anything done. I had to deal with a lot of politics. I'm just like, this is not for me. I have this other thing. It's become an intense second full-time job. I can match my salary now, so I don't even care. And so we just, like, myself and my co-founder, who was at GitHub at the time, we just quit our jobs and we're like, cool, we can do this full time. And then, like, ultimately, as soon as you do that, you take it much more seriously. And we looked around and we saw the competitors that had sprung up. And I'm a very competitive person. And the first thing I thought is, I'm like, we are certainly not going to let them take what we built kind of thing, right? None of them were open source or anything. And so we were like, we have this moral high ground. And we've been doing this for so long. It's sort of like we've earned this opportunity, right? And so then we went out and we raised money. And when we did that, that was the turning point. That's when we said, we're not raising money just like so we can hire some people right now. We're raising money to build this into the biggest thing it can possibly become. Like, it was very much like we never talked about what an end was. We just said we build it bigger, and that's it. And so that's kind of what we've been doing ever since. And that's been 5 years now since we raised that seed round.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you talk about, so, you mentioned that Sentry kind of grew out of Django roots, and that was kind of an era of web development that was, it was like the age of the monolith, so to speak. And the landscape, of course, has evolved over years, both in the form of, like web development. Now there's more multi-service applications, serverless is a thing, and also, additional computing platforms like mobile has grown. There's things like, IoT now, edge computing, if you consider that a thing that didn't exist a couple of years ago. How has Sentry evolved and adapted with the times?
So we've always iterated on what we do from a data collection or instrumentation standpoint. We've always tried to adapt to frameworks and stuff. But what I actually think is super interesting is our core design is still, honestly, it's what you need still today in all paradigms. And I think that works really well for errors. It kind of makes sense. Like, all errors are kind of shaped the same. We did have to make some changes along the way. Like a tangible example is when you are running iOS code, there's a lot of threads running. And it may not be the main thread that's crashing or something. So we had to adapt the system to handle those kinds of cases. Or JavaScript, all the code is compiled and minified and obfuscated, right? And now it's transpiled like from two different languages into like the code you're actually running. So we had to adapt the system to transform everything, right? And that's basically the model we still run today. Is like we just have transformers. It brings it back to the core, and it works for every application in the world. And I actually say that like literally, like we have so many different kinds of applications. To me, that's like really exciting. Like console apps, browser, desktop, IoT, like firmware errors are coming up to us. Nearly every web app in the world. Like it's just really cool that core works so well. And, we're a monolith-ish ourselves. And we actually even make sure Sentry supports monoliths in a really good way, just as we try to make sure it supports service-oriented in a really good way. And some of that was just because, we decided to go down this route, so we had to solve our own problem first, right? And so I think that's been really good for us. I think some of the challenges have come down to, like I mentioned, the GraphQL thing, which is tricky. When you get into performance, it's much, much harder. Like a crash is kind of a crash, no matter how you look at it, with the caveat of like, what's a crash in the browser, right? That's a little fuzzy, but you can reason about it. But so we call our performance stuff transactions. So a request response, right? That's a transaction. What's a transaction in a mobile app? I don't know. It's kind of whatever you think it should be, frankly. Maybe it's a view, maybe it's some other action that you take or something. And so we spent a lot of time trying to reason about how can we create a model, just like our error model is, that works for all of these paradigms. And that's why I went back and I was saying, like, everybody solves for the easy problems first. They solve for infrastructure. It's a very simple known quantity. JavaScript, desktop, and mobile. IoT is even worse, but like those are really complicated scenarios to solve for, especially if you want a truly universal solution. And you might argue universal doesn't matter, but it does matter because applications are so complex these days. And the same argument for tracing is true here. Like, your mobile app is communicating with your API. I don't need to understand the API as a mobile developer, but I do need to know that it's the API's fault. And I need to know it, and the only way I can truly know it is the API's fault is because the API changed. And the root cause can be diagnosed in the API itself. And so because of that, you need connectivity, which is why you actually need that universal platform. And so that's been a lot of our challenges. But I think the core, and going back to I think we're just recreating new solutions to the same old problems. And I truly believe in that because Sentry's I don't know if it's 11 or 12 years old, but it's still the same as it was, that long ago, fundamentally at its core.
Yeah.
So
do you view performance monitoring as a different problem from error monitoring, or are they one and the same? And if they are one and the same, how do you decide what actually is an error versus just, tolerable slowness in an application?
So I would say they are different, but I would reason about it. So to give you insight, we said Sentry's goal, if what Sentry does is it says, hey, here's an error. I'm telling you about it because you caused it. Here's the commit that caused it. If that's fundamentally what we're trying to do today, what we're shifting towards is, hey, you made a change to your code. Here's all of the things that went wrong. If you can imagine anything that can go wrong from that, we want to be able to identify any of those problems. I wouldn't call them all errors, though, at the end of the day. They might be defects or problems or something like that, or in Sentry terms, issues. But they all exhibit very different characteristics, and I think some of it's frankly up to the business to decide what it means, right? My analogy is always if the Uber app crashes, obviously we know that's bad. There's no questioning that. But if the Uber app sits at a loading indicator for 30 seconds, is that bad? It's probably the same as a crash. For all we know, it's going to sit at that loading indicator forever, and it's never going to change, right? That might not even be slow behavior, though, at that point. That's just something's not working and isn't causing an error and isn't slow. And so that's actually another thing we think a lot about. If signups go to 0 and you can correlate it with a release, that is a software monitoring concern. And that's something that most people don't try to address with their monitoring tools. But it's such a fundamental, not only is it super critical, but it's such a fundamentally easy thing to do, too. It's just okay, request to the signup endpoint flatlined, or successful request at the very least. We made a change related, must be, there's a high correlation, right? And so that's fundamentally how we thought about it. So I think if you live in APM land, you say it's all the same thing because it's performance, but in an abstract way. Yep. If you're a developer, performance generally means latency. It doesn't mean errors.
And so when you're defining, what constitutes an issue or not, is that something that you define in kind of the application code? Hey, if this condition happens, send a thing to the Sentry API, or is it something that is more defined after the fact? You're collecting all this data, you're collecting things like request response times, and you notice a spike in one particular metric.
Yeah, so for errors, it's very straightforward. It's like a try-catch statement, effectively. So everybody kind of gets that. For performance, we basically collect it all.
We're going to have some sampling algorithms down the road, but right now just collect it all. You can client-side sample if you want. And then you can ask questions. So going back to this observability idea, like we have the data so we can monitor well. We might find we don't need to store the data, but there's a lot of value in having access to that data, and ideally it's cheap enough to store. So our solution is just like errors are in there, transactions are in there. We collect some other kinds of data like some security reports and things like that. We just call them events internally. So just we collect a lot of events, and the advantage that we have with events and doing the way we do it is it's all structured. There's meaning to everything. And that's such a powerful idea. Like, never build a platform. Just build structured data. Like, build schemas. Schemas are so helpful in everything in life. Like abstractions are valuable, but like, you can't have everything be an abstract.
Yeah.
AI doesn't truly exist these days. So
it's just pattern matching.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I get your like opinionated take on best practices and anti-patterns in production monitoring? Like if I'm, leading a small team inside a large organization, or if I'm developing a new application myself, what are the common pitfalls I'm going to fall into, and what should be kind of the framework that I tried to use when I think about like what tools I should use and how I go about having my team debug production issues?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's this concept, test in production. I hate that. Like one time I had somebody we'd hired and they're like,
can you explain that concept first?
Okay, so test in production. I'm just going to take it the literal sense. Like, we didn't really test this code well. We shipped it to production and it broke, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's not okay. That's never okay. I had to explain to an employee one time that that's never okay. It doesn't matter what our software is for. Like, our software is for detecting those bugs and making it so you can quickly remediate them, right? But to quickly remediate, you still have to do a deploy. You have to deal with customer fallout. So it's never okay. And that's why I don't like this idea of test in production. Like, it's a really like cheeky way to say that you should be willing to accept risk, right? It's move fast, but don't break anything. Like, that's everybody's objective. And I don't know, that's such an important concept to me. So, and what I'm alluding to with that is just like CI and CD is super important. Like with any new software or any new team, the first thing I would do is focus on a fast release lifecycle. And the unfortunate truth is that's really hard to maintain. Like, as applications get bigger and more complex, as infrastructure gets bigger and more complex, it's really hard to do accurate testing or fast testing or both. But I think that's the most important thing you can do from a sort of just prevent the need for production monitoring. But then I would say you adopt first application monitoring before any kind of systems monitoring. Like, yeah, you might need systems monitoring, you might need metrics and stuff, but you can get away a really long time without any of that. Like, I truly believe if you throw Sentry into your application, you might not need anything more until you're like a pretty significant sized organization, because errors are going to be your number one enemy at that point. Like, you're going to catch a lot of things in development, but you're not going to capture everything. And so I think it's important to do something there. I don't know, though. I frankly don't spend a lot of time. Like, I set up Sentry on new projects now, and I'm like, it kind of works. I usually have to tweak a few things to make it fit my need a little bit more, but because everything else, it's like the barriers are so high. Like, we have this CI service that we run. It's public, but I'm pretty sure we're the only consumers of it. And it runs all these different services. It runs a queue, and it runs like a database, and they're all offloaded to somebody, and there's no ops people. It's literally, I just do it in my free time. And it's always breaking. And it's never breaking because of code anymore. It's breaking because like really cryptic stuff is going wrong. And I'm like, it is so hard to get the right instrumentation in there. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. And that's why I'm like, that can't be the solution to the problem. There have to be better ways to solve it.
Makes sense. What are your thoughts on deploying on Fridays and kind of the risk that incurs?
I'm of the mindset that avoid incidents, but don't avoid them. Like, it's like security by obscurity, right? It's the same thing. Don't deploy on Friday because it might break everything. Don't break everything. Like, that's a better solution than don't deploy on Friday. Like, I don't know, because we actually had this problem a lot as a young company, because we actually have 3 offices. One in San Francisco, one in Vienna, which is +9, I think, and then one in Toronto, which is, +3 from us, or minus, I guess, actually. And so they will deploy in the middle of the night, and still today, at 120 plus people in the company, they will sometimes take down everything. For the most part, they're fully staffed and they can handle it. But those situations suck for both the customers and the company, but you have to accept them. And you accept them because then you say, how do we let this never happen again? And that's super important. That's like a super critical part of incident management, right? And I think that's what you do. You say it's fine to deploy on Fridays. Don't deploy after 5 p.m. because nobody should have to get up just because or something. I think those rules are kind of okay. But I also think it's fair to empower people. And I don't know. I'm a believer in, hopefully we're all adults. Clearly with current events in the world, that's not true. But I would like to believe that ideal is fine, to the sense where anybody at Sentry can anybody with a corporate email address in Sentry, unless we've changed it, can deploy Sentry. And actually, I think they can deploy any application in production. Now, they can't necessarily change the application, but they can initiate the deploy lifecycle. And we say that's okay because CI is responsible for saying this is safe to deploy. If it goes into master, it better be safe. And so I think that's really what you got to aim for. And monitoring is your safety net, to the point where we sort of set our 10-year vision is we'd love to get monitoring to be part of testing. If you could canary every change and actively use monitoring, so you still write tests, obviously, but if you could just use real monitoring, real production monitoring, to where you could diagnose those things that aren't tested, but you could do it before it ever happened to your customers. That's the ultimate solution to the problem, right?
Interesting. So would that, in your CI pipeline, you kind of stand up an instance of your application with all the monitoring stuff, you'd hit it with kind of a test workload, and then you'd observe the metrics? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's a practical way you could do it right now today, right?
Yeah.
We built this thing during a hack week where all it did was, it was basically a web scraper. It just tried to, I forget what I called it, Inhuman, I think. It just tried to simulate some really poor user behavior, really dumb AI, right? And we actually ran it. And so it would inject Sentry onto websites. It would man in the middle of the websites and inject Sentry. And then it would just click around and fill out forms and stuff, right? And the demo for Hack Week was kind of interesting because some sites it was really hard to pull off. I don't know what airlines are doing, but for example, there's this pizza company in Canada called Pizza. And if you loaded this up on their website, it found all the bugs. Now, as a user, you load up the website and you instantly find all the bugs because it's just broken all the time. But I'm that's a visible version of what the future can be. And so I think what you're talking about is applicable today, but I think there's a real future with technology. If we can figure out state management and databases where we can actually fully canary production applications where, it's blue-green and stuff today, right? But if instead it's blue-green, it's literally blue-blue, and all your customers are over here, and they're also replicated over here, but that's a different version of your application. But they're not actually experiencing the results. That's the ideal world. But that technologically, from a technology standpoint, that's obviously very, very hard to achieve. And it wouldn't be just us responsible for that at the end of the day. But,
yeah.
It might be possible in our lifetime to see something like that happen.
Yeah, makes sense. You mentioned your kind of 10-year vision, and I wanted to kind of ask you about how you arrived at that. Because, in our conversations, both, this one and earlier, I've picked up a strong ethos from you of being super down to earth, being driven kind of by the immediate pains that you understand. How do you derive kind of a 10-year vision out of that? Doesn't that require you to be a little bit more head in the clouds, highfalutin a bit? So how did you arrive at what your vision is?
Yeah, so an exercise you get whenever you pitch VCs is what's your mission statement or whatever that garbage is, which frankly I think is a waste of time. Mostly because it changes every pitch deck, so it doesn't matter. But I don't know. At some point, one of my friends told me to read this book, which I did not. But it's about root cause analysis, and it's something like the 5 whys. It's by some manager, and it's you ask yourself why 5 times to get to the root cause. Kind of that's the idea. And I never do it 5 times, but I'm always okay, why? Why is this? Why is this? And I use that to work backwards. And so we basically use that to root cause what's our mission statement. And we very simply said, okay, what is Sentry? Well, it's monitoring. Okay. Monitoring is part of the application lifecycle, the development lifecycle. Okay. Development is an efficiency thing. And then we're actually, what's software for? Well, this is the simplest way to reason out. Software only exists for productivity. There's nothing else about it. And so we started there. And then we said, okay, if that's true, which we just have to agree it's true, because it's hard to argue against that, but monitoring must now only exist for productivity because it's only there to enable software development at the end of the day. And so we're well, how would we get monitoring to make us more productive? Well, the tactical version is you ship bugs to production and you can never stop that. And so we make it faster to remediate those bugs. And then the better version would be, well, what if we could prevent those bugs from happening? Because that's a much better outcome in life. And so that's really where we ended up at. is there a real way we could get there that somebody that's technical and well-educated, well-informed could believe in? And I truly believe that we can get there by what I'm saying. And it's not that much of a reach. It's just impossibly hard these days. But I'm very confident that there's at least, a few companies in the world that could do what I'm talking about right now today. And that's super exciting. So we just kind of worked through it. And I actually think that was important because it helped guide us. Because if you think about your goal is that, well, I want to be able to put monitoring into CI and then identify the bugs that the tests are not catching. Well, you first need to be able to identify all the problems. And that's fundamental to monitoring, right? And so you can sort of do those goals in parallel. You can do one before the other kind of thing. But that's how we reasoned about it. So it was just like this forced mental exercise, which was frankly really, really good. But it's also a little bit abstract in that it's not like we're actually working towards that right now, even though we could say we sort of are, right?
Yeah, my next question was going to be, practically speaking, how do you use that vision for like planning purposes? Does it just serve as kind of a backdrop, or do you actually find yourself saying like, well, we should prioritize this over the other thing this quarter because that brings us a step closer to our vision?
I only use it from the point of view to help people understand what we could achieve. Like, what is a big picture item, right? When we think about planning, we have much more core tenets that we follow. So for example, one is front end first. Like, we're very hyper focused on, like, we must solve for the front end customers first. Market share is one of our core tenets. We call it every developer. It's part of our values. We actually have a bunch of values that are not specifically about people. We have one that's about people, and then everything else is just about how we operate. So one is that Sentry is for every developer. We're here to enable every developer. And that can mean many things, but the easiest way to reason about it is like we want to solve the problem for every kind of developer in the world. And so that dictates a lot of like, is this guiding that? And that's kind of how we've reasoned about it, but it's very easy to say, well, like, we need to be able to monitor for more problems, because if we can't monitor for the problems, we can't bring monitoring earlier into the life cycle. It's just useless at that point, right? Yeah. But we never actually talk about the big grand vision other than like, hey, you're the new hire, here's a crazy idea kind of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned that Sentry is for every developer. I talk to a lot of developer tool creators, and one recurring problem I hear about is, let's say you sell into an organization and the people who bring you in are, super gung-ho about your product. But then there's kind of like the remaining developers at the company who may have never heard of you or, don't know what you're all about. Is that a challenge for Sentry, just like spreading awareness inside your customers? And if so, how do you spread the word?
It definitely is a challenge. This is something we're iterating on. So Sentry's always been product-led, and that's frankly because I didn't know how to do anything else. And so we're starting to be a little bit more on the sales and marketing efforts. And I say that because our version of that story that's successful is like, some of it's going to be organic, it's going to be product-led, but a lot of it is like bigger companies, and those bigger companies value different things. And so, for example, we've started trying to like offer our customers sort of more hands-on learning, which is like, hey, we'll like, I guess not in person anymore, but it's like, we'll come in, we're happy to sit down, we can talk a little bit about roadmap, we can show you a little bit more how Sentry can work in these different scenarios, train some folks on it. I think that's been a really good way. That's a very, I don't want to say enterprisey, but it's more of a high-touch solution to the problem, which is often expensive. On the other side, I don't know, like, it's tricky, and I think it's especially tricky with developers, because we're all somewhat empowered to choose our own technology these days, especially because we make a lot of it affordable, and people can just swipe a card, which is great. But we're also all empowered to build our own stuff half of the time, which also creates some dilemmas. And so I think there's still a lot of fragmentation. Like, we're definitely the market leader in our space by any number you would look at, and it's by a large margin. But what you'll find is even in some of our accounts, some of our competitors are in there in like small little silos. And I'm just like, but why? Like, why would this be possible? And, sometimes our competitors do a good job, but there's other competitors that are just like below the bar in every way you would measure them, from like a product usability, from a price point, all this stuff. And I'm like, why wouldn't you just consolidate? Like, why would you not just put it all on ours? And so to some degree, I think building a developer business, you just sort of have to accept that it's probably a war of attrition. Like, you just have to accept that over time, you're going to win developers and lose developers. And there's no real changing that, because people always want to explore new tools, and we let them. And there's always going to be changes, and developers are also like always interested in new technology. So I don't know. It's a tricky problem. I'll let you know once we solved it, but
yeah,
I think it's
definitely. And I think there's also like a strong culture among developers of kind of preserving that freedom of choice, right? Like any tool that tries to lock you in, if people perceive you doing that, that's a huge negative, I think.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And even the people, like, frankly, most people should not care that Sentry is open source-ish. Like, it doesn't really matter to them. They're never going to run it themselves. But we hear, like, many times, it's like, well, we picked Sentry because it's open source. I'm like, yeah, but you're using our SaaS service. Why do you care? And it's like, well, like, maybe one day if, like, your company shut down, we could then run Sentry ourselves. I'm like, well, that's never going to happen. So why do you care? Like it's almost unreasonable why they make the choice. But at the same time, it is, like, it's an important part of it.
Yeah. So yeah, most great tools that I'm aware of, especially developer tools, are ones that you kind of build for yourself. You solve your own use case, scratch your own itch first. As Sentry has grown as a business, do you find yourself having to balance building for yourself with also listening to feedback from users who might not have the same opinions or view of things as you? And if so, how do you do that?
I would say yes and no. In the sense that I will outright tell you that we're not going to do something because I'll probably be nice about it, but generally speaking, it's a bad idea. I will still do that today. Like, if you ask me if we're going to build something, I'll say no.
Can you name are there any examples that come to mind of things that you said no to that people have asked for?
I'm trying to think of something in recent history. I mean, I did just tell everybody we're not building anything to solve China. That's a little bit different of a problem, but...
Oh, like the Chinese market.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't care if there's a bunch of customers asking for us to support China. It's not happening, kind of thing. It doesn't matter if the customer is, like, sort of requesting or demanding that feature. That's not where our focus is right now. And we are big believers in that idea of focus, right? I would say we bend a little bit. So we have a team it's a collective of teams, but one is enterprise. And they're just there to solve these sort of edge cases for our largest customers. And that is very much traditional product. But most of Sentry's investment is R&D, which I am hyper opinionated that R&D has to be opinionated. It cannot be like a traditional product management scheme where you're like, customer, tell me what you want. Okay, I'm going to sort of build that for you. It's got to be like, I have an opinion on what the right thing to do is, and we're going to build that, and we're going to prove that works, or we're going to prove that doesn't work. And that's a very particular way of doing things, but it's a way I believe in if you're ever going to do something serious and that actually innovates, right? So I'd say we have a mix of both, but yeah, generally speaking, we're fairly open with our community. Like, one thing I really valued early on at Sentry is we used GitHub for all of this kind of stuff, and unfortunately we moved away from that, but where, like, people could ask about stuff, we'd publish it on there, we'd respond to folks' questions on there. Like, it was kind of like all out in the open, our roadmap and development, and I know GitLab does this, but when it was on a single repo, it was very tangible and easy to reason about, to the point where, like, if a customer opened a feature request ticket through, like, Zendesk or a bug report, we would just open a ticket on GitHub for them and link them that ticket. Or we'd open the pull request and we'd link them the pull request that fixed it. And that was such a great solution, but it was almost always, I mean, it's almost always just been like, no, we're not doing that. Actually, I can remember a bunch of times now. Like, there was a big company that asked us to implement some weird analytics in the UI, and I'm like, no, like, why would we do that? And they probably would have paid a lot of money, but it was okay.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you gotta, like, factor other feedback into account, but at the end of the day, you gotta be opinionated, because that kind of, it's hard to be focused without being opinionated.
Yeah.
I guess. Cool. Are there any other tools or technologies that you're excited about on the horizon?
What am I excited about? I don't even know. I have a hard time keeping up these days. I've really enjoyed modern iterations of JavaScript, barring the complexity and stuff. Like, I hack on a bunch of things in my spare time. I just recently picked up TypeScript, which I have mixed feelings about, but I haven't really used many tools in recent history. I love GitHub Actions. I also love that GitHub does not charge us when they probably should. So hopefully they don't fix that. Yeah. But that's probably the only product I've used in recent history that I'm like, and it's not perfect by any means yet, but but it's also a soft spot for me, like CI and CD. Yeah, I don't know. Like, honestly, most of my days are spent, like, around my calendar now and sort of planning and communications and stuff, unfortunately. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. A lot of my personal time has been, like, messing around with, like, smart home type stuff and just toying with technology again. So
awesome. So for those listening who, they're interested and they want to try out Sentry, how would you recommend people get started with it?
Go to the website, click sign up, and do what it tells you. hopefully, as long as you can deploy quickly, you'll be up in a few minutes.
My guest today has been David Cramer. David, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks again for having me.
The Sourcegraph podcast is a production of Sourcegraph, the universal code search engine, which gives you fast and expressive search over the world of code you care about. Sourcegraph also provides code navigation abilities like jump to def and references in code review, and integrates seamlessly with your code host, whether you're working in open source or on a big, hairy enterprise codebase. To learn more, visit sourcegraph.com. See you next time.